Jerusalem, ikayalami, ngilondoloze, uhambenami, zungangishilana. Jerusalem, ikayalami, ngilondoloze, uhambenami, zungangishilana. I'm not perfect, I came from ruthless times as a juvenile. Ilondoloze, zungangishilana. Look into my eyes, see pain and sacrifice. What's goes on my mind, just trying to survive. Ilondoloze, zungangishilana. Tomaka emo wuru, oti wuru si wuru. Give me one minute.
ngishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami
Jerusalem, ikayalami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalem, ikayalami ilondoloze.
Sakutuka satipega nansi patapat. Sakutuka satipega nansi patapat. Sakutuka satipega nansi patapat. Sakutuka satipega nansi patapat. Iya mama nansi patapat. Iya mama nansi pat. Iya mama nansi patapat. Iya mama nansi pat. Johannesburg way, and everybody starts to move as soon as Pata Pata starts to play. Woo!
The distance from London in the UK to Cape Town, South Africa is 9,634 kilometers or 5,987 miles. The distance from Vilnius in Lithuania to Cape Town, South Africa is 9,876 kilometers or 6,137 miles. From Hamburg in Germany to Cape Town is 9,762 kilometers, or 6,066 miles. The journey of what was to become the South African Jewish community began in those cities, though the journey of the Jewish people is a far longer one and began far, far earlier. But what is the distance in thought that brings vastly different communities together to make a new one? Is there in fact a synthesis to be found from the mountains of the Cape to the plains of the Highveld? The adventurer Jew from a formal Britain, the exhausted Smos from a shtetl, the fearful refugee from a Germany turned upside down, all walked the path to where this community is now. To bring our story to a close, it's time to consider. To journey requires some sustenance, as does robust discussion. In our telling of this story, though we have mentioned markets and livelihoods, we haven't really mentioned the foods of this community. English Jewish cookery? Well, a lot of that is derived from Portuguese immigrant Jews. Litvak cooking is strongly Ashkenazi, influenced by its location, and Litvak Ashkenazi cooking is what dominates in South Africa. German Jewish? Since the Germanic region was called Ashkenaz, we know what that's about. So, to find our community's eating habits, though, we have to start with bread.
Food and Jews seem to go together like that.
Absolutely.
And we have an entire heritage that has been brought over by the Jewish immigrants into this country. Let's take it apart a little bit. One of the things you started off talking about was cheesecake as being particularly iconic.
Every bris, every shul meeting, everything, wherever you go, there's a cheesecake.
And of course, originally made with what were for the time cheap ingredients.
Yes, because there was, that people made their own cream cheese. They made their own sour milk. They made, sometimes they didn't even have a base. But the base was a very simple base. Little flour, sugar, a little bit of fat. And that was it.
Just talking about that, I think one of the problems that a lot of young cooks deal with from time to time is measurements. There are granny's measurements and there are proper baking measurements.
Yes.
I remember my grandmother used to drive my mother insane because she'd say, "How much flour do you use?" And she'd say, "So much."
And if it doesn't feel right, then you put it, but how do you know it doesn't feel right?
You know.
You just feel.
And a glug of oil, just a glug.
Yeah.
How much is a glug? You turn the bottle, it goes glug. The Sephardic traditions.
Yes.
Most of the immigrants went to Central Africa and then to what was Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, and most of them came and went directly there. And it's only fairly recently that they've come into South Africa. But those Sephardic traditions, given the fact of where they come from, that Mediterranean basin, how different is their food to Ashkenazi food?
I think the Sephardic food is spicier, really tasty. And to them, our food is so bland and so boring.
There's a lot of intermarriage between Ashkenazic and Sephardic families in South Africa. And of course, I think one of the first things that happens is the exchange of recipes.
Exactly.
This is what we make, this is what we eat, what do you eat? And that's how the families get together.
Well, I love spicy food, so I love Sephardic food.
Well, back to the challah, but
yes.
Do you know the reason why South Africa is the only country in the world that calls challah kitka?
I've heard many stories, but I'd like to hear your story.
Apparently, kit is the Lithuanian word for putty or for plaster. Right. And kitka was the slang for plasterwork that you'd find around the cornices of your ceiling and your center rows. You know, all that decorative plaster molding?
Yes.
Very intricate little things intertwined and plaited together, things like that. So in South Africa, the very notion of plaiting the bread, which is traditional,
Yes.
reminded them of kitka work, and so they started referring to it as kitka. So there we are, but the only country in the world that refers to it as kitka. Otherwise, it is challah universally. Because the food in Lithuania was poor people's food, they were using what they had and making it, extending it, making it go further. And I think of something like tsimis, okay, which is a stew with either fruit, prunes, things like that, or with a specific vegetable, carrot tsimis.
Right.
How different is that from a breadie in South Africa? Because it's, again, the meat is there to flavor the vegetables.
It's sweeter. It's a lot sweeter. You're using sweet potatoes, you're using carrots, you're using syrup.
A lot of discussion going on in South Africa at the moment about a particular speciality that is found in the inland communities amongst the Afrikaans community, which calls it the Joodse koek, the Jewish cake. Judentet.
Yeah. Interesting story was that it was from farm days. Layers of sponge cake, and then you would put a layer of cake and a layer of custard. And I think what happened was that somebody must have said to one of their friends, "You must go down the road and taste the lady's Judentet, the Judentet."
There was a big divide within the Pale of Settlement. There were two schools and approaches to the amount of sweetness in any dish.
Right. Polish sweeter, definitely. And in fact, somebody once said to me, "You can see you've got Polish blood in you." So I said, "Wow." He says, "Everything you make is sweet." He says, "Even your marinades are sweet." I make a lot of pickles, a lot of pickled cucumber, a lot of cabbage, carrots. We love herring. We love gefilte fish. I love fried fish balls, and we make quite a bit of that.
So that's going northern.
That's
going into Lithuanian territory,
correct.
where fermenting and sour, the whole notion of
Sourness.
Do you think we'll ever have a truly Jewish South African cuisine?
I think it's more, you can basically do anything if it's, keeping kosher. It doesn't have to, you don't have to sort of separate the two, Look, we're going to cook a lot of what our mothers cooked. And I can even see it with my daughter who recently got married. I can see how she's cooking. She follows what I used to do. I just want to come back to a quick story. We were talking about challah. I got a phone call from a girl and she said to me, "Sharon, we're going up Kilimanjaro." She said, "We wanted to bake challah on Kilimanjaro."
As one does.
Yes.
As one does.
We're going to be there for Shabbos. We wanted to. Fine. She says, "Start experimenting." Okay. And that's when it started. I started interviewing people. And in fact, it was Nelson Mandela's cook, okay, in his house, who taught me how to make potted bread. And it was so easy to make, and it was so delicious. And it's made traditionally on a fire, so you could make it on a braai. And I did it on my gas stove in a pot. And you know that once a month I do it. I make challah in the pot, potted bread.
In an earlier episode, we visited the Kaplan Center in Cape Town, the most important institute of Jewish studies on the African continent. Since the founding of the institute, it has been engaged in evaluating and understanding the South African Jewish community. The director and associate professor of history is Adam Mendelsohn.
South African Jews are very much part of South African society, and again, it's not a new finding in any way. That's a long-running pattern. It's one of the things we see with almost since the original immigration of Jews to South Africa, is this very quick process of what scholars would call acculturation, becoming South African, wanting to be seen as South African, sending your children to schools, to public schools in the immigrant generation, adapting to South African sport, and otherwise being proudly South African in all sorts of ways. We certainly still see that. And likewise, what we see as well, and again, I think this has become more of a central feature of Jewish life in South Africa since the 1990s, is the sense that the Jewish community needs to give back to the broader society.
I'm a South African Jew, which means that by definition, my Jewishness is defined by my place of birth, which is the country of South Africa. And there's no question that I'm a proud Jew. I've been brought up as a traditional Jew. I had an education in a government school through until primary school, and then afterwards I went to King David High School. But there's no question that we have lived in the South African culture, and we have imbibed so much of what South Africa stands for, that wonderful human warmth and spontaneity. The local indigenous culture of every country that I have visited rubs off on the Jews of that country. And I think that this is the wonderful chameleonic quality of the Jew. And that is that wherever we are in the world, we retain our Jewishness, we retain our value system. We look to Israel as being the country to which we would aspire to live in one day. But while we are in the country in which we are, we make an enormous contribution. And we live amongst the people as proud Jews and as proud South Africans or Argentinians or English or Americans.
I've always been a very, very proud South African, but I'm also a very proud Jewess. Which comes first? I guess my identity of being Jewish is probably first, so I would say I'm a proudly Jewish South African. But interestingly enough, I've traveled to many countries around the world in this position. And when people immigrate, they are firstly South African, because that accent never goes away. So that stays with you. But in my case, I think I'd be Jewish before South African.
I'm third generation South African. My parents born in South Africa and their parents, and then their parents came from Lithuania.
My father's father, he was the first generation South African. He was the son of Holocaust survivors, in fact. But on my mother's side, the Lithuanian Jewry from one of the first waves of migration.
I'd say I'm a Jewish South African because I have a lot bigger pull towards my Judaism. I practice it a lot more. I'm more aware of it than being a proud South African. But I would still consider South African very strong in my identity. Learning about the history in school and in university, they really try to emphasize the importance of being a proud South African. And I think being a South African is quite unique. Like we grow up in a very unique situation as opposed to other people around the world. And I never really want to let go of that. So even though I'm a Jewish South African, I would say South African is still very, very important to me.
As a history lover, I couldn't help myself but try and find out, talk to the older generation. I had countless conversations with my grandmother, regarding the early days, the first sort of German Jewish communities, their interaction with the Lithuanian communities. So in terms of that, I think I wouldn't say I have a comprehensive grasp, but I think I do, maybe understand in a more holistic sense what the history of our community.
You can't actually get South Africa can't get Africa rather out of your bones if you're born and bred in South Africa or anywhere in Africa.
And wherever you go in the world, the South African Jews are proud Jews, traditional Jews. They're proud to say we were South African, we are South African. South Africa produced some of the greatest communities and individuals. And when I'm not talking about financially, I'm talking about as proud Jews. We are all proud South Africans, but we are proud Jews as well. The South African government, unfortunately, is trying to separate, and the world is, the Jew from Israel, saying Israel is we love your Jews, but we don't like the apartheid state of Israel. That's what they are trying to do. They're trying to separate Israel from the Jew. We as a Jewish community cannot allow that. But South Africa, our leaders, Chief Rabbi Casper, Harris, Louis Rabinowitz, Dushinsky, all those before, etc., allowed a traditional, warm, proud Jewish community and individual to live and grow. It's a proud, proud community that we once had here. And these people, as we know, go all over the world and they become involved in their local communities, and they're huge assets to these small communities that they find themselves in.
I've seen it all over the world. I've seen it with alumni who have resettled in other countries years later. The nostalgia and the feeling, the fond memories they have of King David, and when they come around a reunion, that Jewish South African personality is so real and so unique.
In 2019, the Kaplan Center instituted a community survey.
These are very extensive surveys. They ask a whole variety of questions, and some of them are with a practical application in mind. So again, in terms of communal planning purposes, thinking about how many beds you need in a Jewish old age home, how many desks you need in a Jewish school, questions which are designed with those sort of intentions in mind. But likewise, there are lots of questions which are designed to get a sense of how the community is thinking and feeling. A number of people who read the survey and read our findings were very surprised about the total population of Jews in South Africa, that there hadn't been reliable data on the size of the Jewish population in South Africa since the 2001 national census on the size of the community. But there's a clear pattern of a community which was decreasing in size, both because of immigration and because of natural aging. The median age, the midpoint age in the community was creeping upwards.
The Jews in the country are certainly diminishing over the years. I think that we started off with about 120,000 Jews in its heyday. Today we're probably less than 50,000 Jews in the country. I think I'm comforted by having had the opportunity of traveling to many countries in the world, in Europe and elsewhere, where I have seen the tremendous resilience of the Jew. And to think that Lithuania, which is the country which over 90% of our community is comprised, there is still a Jewish community in Lithuania, despite the fact that 90% of the Jews of Lithuania were murdered in or around the Second World War. You have Jews living in Poland today, and there are still functioning synagogues in both Vilna and in Warsaw. And you also have functioning Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal. So really what I'm looking at are two European countries, East European countries, that were affected by the Holocaust, which was a terrible tragedy and catastrophe that happened in the 20th century. And then we're looking back to the 15th century to look at the catastrophic effects of the Inquisition. And yet Jews persist and still remain in those communities today, albeit that they're a shadow of their former selves. So if we look at South Africa, thank God we can't even talk in the same breath about the catastrophic effects that happened to Jews in Western and Eastern Europe. But still you're seeing a diminishing Jewish community, and they are leaving here not specifically because there is anti-Semitism or anything against the Jewish community per se, despite the fact that we do have forces at play in the community who are anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. But notwithstanding, the Jewish community, I believe, will continue, because I think that this is a country that is renowned for freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and Jews have created a wonderful niche in this community and are able to contribute as we always have been. And for that reason, I believe that we have a future here.
The emphasis at King David has always been on excellence. And that has been, I think, a good strategy, because what we've seen is that although the numbers in the community have dwindled, the numbers at King David's schools have remained relatively stable. And I think that talks to the strategy of excellent teaching, excellent facilities, excellent curriculum, just a real emphasis on excellence across the board in education.
I'm not sure about whether a community will re-establish itself. However, I do think the very Frum community will stay and will grow exponentially, because that's what they do wherever they are. And I don't know how true it is, but I heard many years ago that the late Rebbe Schneerson said, this is a wonderful place to be. And his followers, his Lubavitch followers, are quite happy here. And as far as I know, have no plans to move anywhere else, because they like to establish themselves all over the world, thank goodness, which which means that wherever you go, you may not find the others, but you can always find a Chabad shul. It's difficult to know whether there will be a community or not, but I do think there will always be Jews in South Africa. Well, I would like to hope that there are always Jews in South Africa, considering the fact that my father was one of the early one of the early arrivals. He came from Lithuania in the 19th century, and it would be very sad if there was nobody left. But it's difficult to answer that question, with any kind of certainty. You can't do that.
Over the past 10 years, there's been very little transition out of the small country communities. People that are there choose to be there. Their children have already left and gone overseas or living in the bigger centers, and they choose to be in the areas. They choose to remain farming on family farms. You get people that go down to the coast and become part of coastal communities. There's still very much a vibe. Admittedly, it's not what it was in the 1950s or the 1960s. Having said that, neither is South African Jewry.
Another finding, which again has these same sort of ambiguous elements to it, relates to what's happened in terms of religious life within the community. One of the other trends which had been evident in these previous surveys, again evident in 1998, evident in 2005, was how, particularly in Johannesburg, there was a significant religious revival, particularly sort of an Orthodox religious revival, and a whole range of more traditional practices appearing, and likewise a community which, in terms of how individuals express their beliefs, was becoming more religious. To me, a more interesting finding was what is happening outside of Johannesburg. That even as Johannesburg has become more traditional and more observant, and more orthodox in a variety of ways, we see the opposite pattern, or again a contradictory pattern, in Durban and Cape Town. That in Cape Town, what we've seen is polarization, where Jews have, in many cases, there are certainly those who've become more religious, but likewise those who've become less religious, those who identify as cultural Jews, as secular Jews. And what's happened in both Durban and in Cape Town is that the previous category which had dominated, and which had dominated in Johannesburg as well, which was a self-definition as traditional, that I'm a traditional Jew. 2/3 of Jews in South Africa had identified in our previous surveys as traditional. Now that category, that middle category, had collapsed. And now less than 1/3 of Jews in South Africa identify as traditional.
It comes from our leaders. Louis Rabinowitz, Casper, Harris were tolerant of everybody as Jews. I accept you as a Jew and for who you are. On a Jewish level and on a communal level, you are equal to anybody else in this Jewish community. That, unfortunately, doesn't exist any longer in South African Jewry and in the world, because you have a situation of polarization.
The South African style of religion, of Judaism, which is often described as this non-observant Orthodox, as people who belong to an Orthodox synagogue, but don't necessarily attend that synagogue, or drive to that synagogue when on the occasions rare or frequent that they do go. So they again drive to a synagogue, and the synagogue has a parking lot, and they're breaking the Sabbath by driving there. That sort of style, it still exists without question, and is still, as I described, 1/3, just under 1/3 of South African Jews still describe themselves as traditional. But both in terms of self-definition and in practice, we see significant changes. So, for example, Jews used to be very, very prominent within academic life at South African universities. We still do see that to some extent, but I think there is a generational shift that certainly, and this is again relates to broader dynamics at South African universities. So an older generation has retired or are approaching retirement, and there are fewer Jews. There are still some Jews who are very prominent in academic life, but perhaps fewer than once was the case. In other areas, for example, in politics, that there are still Jews involved in, particularly Jews involved in radical politics, which in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s meant becoming involved in the anti-apartheid movement. We still do see Jews becoming involved in radical movements in South Africa. I think that, again, Jews are still very prominent in a variety of social civil society initiatives in important NGOs which are founded in South Africa, and Equal Education and others, where we see again an interesting involvement in activist Jews.
Attending the Wits campus and seeing sort of a microcosm of South African society, seeing the civil activity, not just of Jewry, but of the entire Wits community, and you're seeing how Jews have gotten involved in the civil society and civil action. It's it really is inspiring, and when I'm at Wits and I am seeing the interaction we have between whether it be at Wits administration or we have a speaker, in that moment I really do feel South African.
I think Austin Sorge's our three pillars are Judaism, Zionism, and South Africa. So it's very much integrated in our everyday life, like Judaism and South Africa. And I think also, like Dylan was saying, like at university, we being taught so much about South African history, and they really try to get every student to be proud South Africans. But at the same time, it's also really important, like living in South Africa, you still have to be a proud South African. You still need to want to help the community in South Africa and be a part of it.
I think it's interesting to look at it from this perspective, that the Jewish community is entirely self-sufficient. We have our own schools, our own security, essentially our own health insurance. But one thing that the Jewish community doesn't have that maybe US Jewry has is their own university. And a lot of South African Jews, especially Johannesburg Jews, will go to Wits, and there isn't any more of that support that they got growing up, and there's no interaction with the community in that space, and that's where Soldiers comes in. And whether that function is protecting Jewry, creating a fellowship, or just keeping people in touch with the Jewish community on campus, there's been a consistent Jewish presence amongst the students and the lecturers. I mean, in fact, it's a running joke that amongst the Jews at least, that you can ask any random person at Wits and they'll be involved with the Jews somehow. To say that it's on the same level of community interaction maybe as it was, or it's difficult to say that. And there isn't a substantial Jewish presence that there once was, and for Soldiers to be there and operate in that environment, a lot of people find it extremely important, and an extremely important aspect of their university life.
In previous years, it was a lot more intense. I think there were students who were afraid to walk on university campuses, show their Judaism. But I think today it's a lot more safe. People are a lot more open to ideas, a lot less open to conflict. I feel that it gets less intense. And there are maybe moments where, it elevates. But at the moment, I don't think people are afraid to show their Judaism.
Yes, unfortunately, the union has a bit of an image as an old person's organization, but it's not that, because we now have groups of young women who are very aware of the desperate need in the wider community, in the outreach community, for helping members of other race groups, and they're coming forward. I think it's 2 weeks ago, we started a brand new branch of young girls in Cape Town who are very aware of the need for sanitary wear for young girls so that they don't miss a week of school every month, etc., etc. And they approached the Union of Jewish Women and said they would like to be part of it, primarily because there's good governance and they can get assistance and help and publicity and what have you from the Union of Jewish Women. And that's what we're also pushing at the moment. So these young girls who want to do particular projects, and we're only too happy to have them because those particular projects are vital.
Anybody with a sensitivity and a knowledge of history and of Jewish history will tell you that we've always fought well above our weight in the ring, so to speak. And Jews have made an inordinate contribution in every country in which they've lived. And we just have to look at the Nobel Prizes that have been handed out over the years, and you see the inordinate and the huge percentage of Jews that have won those prizes. So Jews have never been bothered by size and number. I mean, that is our destiny. We've always been a tiny nation amongst giant nations. And yet, the fact that we are small in number has never precluded us or been an obstacle to us availing ourselves of opportunities and making a contribution. And Jews are people that somehow have a drive to contribute. It comes from the fact that Abraham, right to our origins, Abraham was a man that did not rest. He had a message and he traveled and he spoke to the world about that message and changed the world from having a father that was an idol worshipper. And that drive and that desire to change and to make the world a better place, I think is an inherent part of the soul of the Jew. To get involved in politics to protect the underdog, to advance technology and to advance all that society has to offer for the good of society and for the good of the world. And that's very much what we refer to in Jewish thought about tikkun olam, fixing the world. Jews are fixers. And that seems to be a deep-rooted psychological and emotional and spiritual drive within the Jew. So I think that is going to continue no matter what our numbers in this country.
There will always be people who care about others, whether there are large numbers or small numbers. I mean, if you know that saying from the Torah, he who saves one life, it's as if he's saved. That's how the union operates. If we only have, let's say hypothetically, 40 members of the union in 15 years' time, I can promise you that those 40 members will do whatever they can to continue working. Obviously, the beneficiaries will be far fewer in number and the what they're able to raise, etc. But there will always be that kind of importance within the Jewish community because that's who we are. The Jewish community is a giving community. We give whatever we can. So much has been taken from us in the years that we've learnt that the best way to survive is to give. You get far more pleasure giving than receiving. We make an incredible difference, and I think Jewish women all around the world make an incredible difference. And however many Jewish women are left in South Africa, they will make a difference. They will continue making a difference.
I read what I read. I keep up to date with all the Jewish press. And yes, there are definitely isolated anti-Semitism instances, but I think they are relatively few and insignificant. They happen all over the Jewish world. And I have to say no. I have to say that I think that anti-Semitism in South Africa is, I don't want to say not non-existent, but extremely, extremely low. And have I personally encountered anti-Semitism? Not in recent memory, no, thank God.
You know, my very first politics lecture, and we were split into groups, and a girl started off with, the Jews secretly control America. There's been, Israel Awareness Weeks where we've had gross anti-Semitism with, the Magen David made into a swastika. And personally, though, the more recent one, shortly before we went into lockdown, a member of the EFF was talking about the Oppenheimers and the Rothschilds getting to Mandela. And when I confronted him, this confrontation spilled over into the lecture, and I had to sort of defend myself against the whole class shouting at me about how I was wrong. It's not anti-Semitism and being oversensitive, and it does come out when it's triggered. We're often criticized, just for even existing on VIT, saying our very existence brings about anti-Semitism, but it's not us that brings the anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is there. It's just we express our Jewish and that we faced with it. But, like I said, the situation at WITS has gotten a lot better. The Jews on campus have never been in a stronger position. We have a Jewish girl on the SRC, and it really is a sort of a positive situation. We were in 2013 with calls to kill the Jew, and 2017 with extremely antagonistic Israel Awareness Week.
We don't have that much anti-Semitism. We're actually quite a fortunate Jewish community. But if things get really, really bad, the Jews have gone through enough. We've gone through more than enough in our history from time immemorial. We don't need to open ourselves up to more abuse or, whatever else would come our way simply because we are Jewish and because we are white, unfortunately. That's a reality as well. It's not only being Jewish, but it's being white in a country where we are accepted as Jews with a lot of warmth, but there is an underlying antagonism towards us. I mean, if you take, for example, the EFF, Julius Malema has blatantly at times said, this is not a place for white people to live. Quote unquote, this is not a place for Jewish people to live. There's always that 1 foot in and 1 foot out kind of thing, which I think has characterized Jewish communities around the world also forever. The wandering Jew, that's who we are. And Israel was the first time we stopped being wandering. We've become part of the international community. We do as the international community does, and that is migrate. And we migrate where it's best for us. Not always, but if it's best for us from a point of view of personal safety, then I think we will go.
It's a lot to do with our Lithuanian heritage. And I think that we see in the Jewish community the fact that there is, as I said earlier, a retention of our Jewish values. Lithuanian Jews were predominantly from a culture of learning. And I'm not saying that every Jew that came to this country was a Talmid Chacham, but there was always a reverence for learning, and there was always a very strong consciousness of the importance of community. And from the moment that Jews landed in this country, they would buy land, they would build a synagogue, they would build a mikveh, they would build a Jewish day school, they would build a cheder for young children to be educated. And there was also a tremendous feeling of responsibility one for the other. And that you see very much with the charitable organizations that have been created, where the Chevra Kedisha always ensured that everybody had an honorable burial. And that money was also used to sustain families. So that once again really talks to the Jewish spirit wherever we are in the world. And I think that that's what we've exemplified in this country. We've built an incredibly strong community on the shoulders and the endeavors of our Jewish forefathers that came here well over 100 years ago and laid very strong foundations, which has facilitated a very sophisticated and strong Jewish infrastructure that deals with everything from charity to education and everything else that a Jew needs to live a Jewish life in the diaspora.
The fact of the matter is that the South African Jewish community is dwindling throughout the country, from Port Elizabeth to East London to Johannesburg to Pretoria, etc. It's a reality. We need not see it as something negative. It's a reality. South Africa, for 150 or 200 years from the 1820 settlers, or you can say from the early 1900s when Jews came of pogroms, etc., was a safe haven and an amazing country for Jews to live. Yes, there was slight anti-Semitism, slight, not slight, there was, but there were no massacres, etc. Jews were able to speak up, and we know about those that were involved in fighting apartheid, etc. But South Africa was an incredible country for over 150 years to allow us to live our lives as Jews, freely, as traditional Jews, as religious Jews, if people chose to do that. And now they're moving on to the next stage of their existence or life, or you can call it that. We need to see how the transition is taking place.
When I see the younger women in the Union of Jewish Women, and the older ones, but the younger ones who've got these fabulous ideas about what to do and how to give and where the needs are, that's the neshama. They give their children's toys, they give everything in order to see little children and elderly people smile and say thank you. All the reward you need is in that smile and in that thank you, nothing else. So there can't not be some kind of a Jewish community left in South Africa, and there can't not be a Union of Jewish Women in that community. It will always be there because of our neshama, because of our souls.
We know that that too is in danger because many of the donors have emigrated or are emigrating. Many of them have passed away or are elderly, and their children are not continuing the legacy of their parents. They are allocating their charity money to other areas, which is their absolute choice. The community is going to feel that huge vacuum very soon. Therefore, there has to be already now, if it hasn't begun, every organization needs to begin downscaling and become forward-thinking and planning for the future, because the day will come when an organization will have no paying members, but there will still be a need for that organization. And how will they sustain it? That is the big question.
There will definitely always be a community. The question is, how will the community look? My gut feel says it will be an aging community because there will be many who don't leave or choose not to leave or can't leave. But youngsters who feel they want other opportunities and have the means will leave. And that doesn't bode well for a growing community. So I think it will continue to be a shrinking community, but there will always be a community.
I'm astonished, I must tell you, that some of the extremely wealthy ones who could leave are still here, but then on the other hand, they do have homes all over the world. So, you know, at any sign of trouble, they can go. You know, they can emigrate and feel much better.
My thinking, and looking at, first of all, smaller communities in South Africa that have diminished in numbers, as well as other African countries and other general communities around the world in the diaspora, there will always be a Jewish presence in South Africa. The question is, what will the viability of a community be? And second of all, what viability will there be as a community to sustain all these massively top-heavy organizations that are currently being fed by a handful of donors?
There are potential financial problems ahead for the community, and we've seen some of that already, that it's a community which has an elaborate infrastructure of its own welfare organizations, its own schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to be able to sustain that, again, it's a community which requires younger people who are going to remain here, who are going to, in a way, pay into the system, contribute to the system in terms of their time, in terms of their generosity and otherwise. So again, it's something which the community has to worry about, but it's not a new worry. I mean, that's, to me, important to remember here, that South African Jews have experienced immigration. There are very few families, Jewish families in South Africa, who don't have relatives, often close relatives, living abroad. And so it's something we're familiar with and have dealt with for a long time. And so it's not new, but obviously it's something which has potential consequences for the community.
There is a thinking that just like South Africans pumped money into Israel all the years, we had the IUA, UCF, whatever it was called, and they channeled money to Israel, etc., that all of a sudden Israel and other organizations like the American Joint and the World Jewish Congress is going to pump money to save and sustain the remnants of a once thriving South African Jewish community. In my humble opinion, it ain't going to happen. They have bigger areas to allocate their funds, and why should they? They've never pumped money into Zimbabwe, which had 8,000 Jews, very wealthy, very prominent, very Zionistic community that allocated and transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel. Israel gives them nothing in return. And when we say Israel, it's not the state of Israel, it's the Jewish agency. They also have overheads. They also have expenses to absorb all the olim, all the projects that they're undertaking. We in the country communities look after hundreds of cemeteries around the country and thousands of graves. We often put on Facebook postings of a specific cemetery that has been vandalized or neglected. And we say, please, will family members that have family buried there, that are now living overseas, family members, please contribute to the restoration of the cemetery. We have yet to receive enough to restore one cemetery. And what's $500? It's not a lot of money, but in rands, it's a lot of money. People are not sending money from overseas any longer. They're not making provisions here in South Africa. That's why in the Country Communities Department, how have we sustained ourselves for so long that when communities close, we take the capital that was derived from the sale of the assets of the congregation, and we invest it. And we have funds that were with the Board of Deputies and still with the Board of Deputies, Jewish Board of Deputies, from 1955. The sale of the Allowell North Shul was 20,000 Rand. But that money is still there. And we're able, all right, it needs assistance, to look after that cemetery. There were forward-thinking members of that community all those years ago.
I think it definitely comes from parents who see maybe a different future for their children outside of South Africa. And I also think the reality is that when you are faced with an education system who, is only allowing 2 children, white Jewish children, into a faculty where previously there were hundreds allowed into a faculty, I think children themselves say, well, let me see what else is available overseas. So I think it's pretty much a parent coupled with a child decision.
I do have a strong pull to making Aliyah. I've been on programs in Israel. My sister's made Aliyah. A lot of my distant family have. And I just always feel like Israel is a Jewish homeland. It was made for all Jews to go and live there. So I do feel this pull, like I said, I'm a Jewish South African, so I'll always be a South African at heart, but that pull to Israel is a lot stronger than the pull to stay.
I find myself at a crossroads, and I'm sure many, young South African Jews do, whether to stay or whether to leave. But, like Galia said, I will always be South African at heart, whether I'm here or, wherever else the Jewish immigration has gone.
The future of South Africa, I see it is less cynical than I think maybe the older generation. Like I feel that my parents and my aunts and uncles and the older generation see that, there's no hope. Apparently, if you look at the SRC at universities and the younger generation, they all want to make South Africa a better place. I see a lot of hope for the future of South Africa, like less corruption, a safer environment. There's so many more organizations and programs to educate children, around South Africa. However, as a Jewish community, as a future, not as positive, I think. I think there's a huge pull for immigration and for people to, move to other countries. And especially if people are making Aliyah, they're going, you're making Aliyah and everyone's saying it's not an easier life, it's a harder life. But people are still choosing that over, living here. Because I guess at the end of the day, you choose your battles. Wherever you live, there's going to be hardships and everyone's just choosing which one they feel they would like to conquer.
But, looking at it, it might sound a bit strange to some, but I believe we have similar problems to the United States. It's not some, radical decline and, chaos. It's a slow deterioration at certain aspects. And I believe a lot of it is spurred by, a large amount of money involved in politics and, just the lack of a political will. Oftentimes what happens is you reach a point where, in democracies, people no longer can accept this. And, hopefully that point does come soon rather than later. And, I believe in the United States it maybe has come already. And I do think a similar thing will happen. It'll be shocking to some, but, I am somewhat hopeful.
If they are to leave, in a way, if they go to Australia or to the UK or to Israel or elsewhere, what is likely there is that if they have children, those children will grow up in those societies, and they are lost to the South African Jewish community. So again, it's not just the loss of community members; it's a loss of part of the South African Jewish future as well. So that's I suppose the existential concern for the communities, that immigration is a long-running trend within South African Jewish life, that this community is now less than half the size it was in the early 1970s.
Wherever you go in the world, you will find an identifiable South African personality. And you can hear, I think it's vague. There are quite a few South African Jewish personalities in South Africa, or persona in South Africa. But I guess hopefully when push comes to shove, we would all gather together and protect one another and have El Al in the background waiting to remove us should the situation become totally untenable.
South Africa will always have a Jewish presence. An active Jewish community, I don't know about.
I think one of the distinct patterns with South African Jews has been that they are very much part and parcel of South African life, and they're proudly South African, and that's not new in any way. That if you look at how Jewish institutions celebrate South Africanness and celebrate, for example, Jews who played for the Springbok rugby team, or Jews who've been successful in one way or another in South African society, that's all about South Africanness, this sense of being part of our broader society. I think that as long as Jews are embraced within South Africa, as long as this multicultural trend continues, that the South Africanness, and the sense of South Africanness, will persist. And likewise, we see it as well with Jews who've left South Africa retain a very strong sense of South Africanness. At least they themselves do. We've actually tested this, their children much less so. So those who immigrate to Israel, South Africa, Canada, or elsewhere, they continue to have a close sense of association with South Africa. That South Africanness doesn't disappear. That's clearly the influence of South African society, the culture in which they are immersed and that they're very, very proud of.
People want to belong to it. People want to be identified. And that's what it's about. And that's how we have, to a percentage, sustained the country communities. We keep on finding more and more people.
There's always hope. If there's no hope, God help us. Jews live with hope.
When a story is told, if it is about the past, for the duration of that telling, people live again. For over 200 years, the story of the South African Jewish community has been recounted in different ways. At times, the narrative was fragmentary, at others, whole. Sometimes the story satisfied, and at others, it raised questions. Extraordinary individuals populated it, and ordinary ones. Some names have been forgotten, some events may have been a little confused. But the community still exists, here at the foot of Africa. And the story will be told as a memory for the future.
Sometimes alone in the evening, I look outside my window at the shadows in the night. I hear the sound of distant crying, the darkness multiplying, and weary hearts denied. All I feel is my heartbeat, beating like a drum, beating with confusion. All I hear are the voices telling me to go, but I could never run. 'Cause in my African dream, there's a new tomorrow. My African dream is a dream that we can follow. Now when the night begins to fall, I listen for your call, I listen for your heartbeat. Alone my dream is just a dream, another false illusion, a shadow in the night. All I want is for our hearts to be beating just as one, to silence the confusion. Then the pain and the
I